As discussed in the last video lecture, the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis of the endocrine system directs the physiological activities of the reproductive system in both men and women. So just to review, what we are talking about is that a hormone, a tropic hormone called GnRH, is released from the hypothalamus, travels to the anterior pituitary through a closed circulatory system, and then diffuses out, binds receptors on cells in the anterior pituitary, and triggers the release of the gonadotropins. So gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers the release of two hormones known as the gonadotropins. Those hormones are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These gonadotropins will circulate in the systemic circulation until they reach the gonads, which in males are testes, females are ovaries, and trigger the release from the gonads of other hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And those hormones have will circulate and bind receptors on cells in the reproductive system to trigger normal function of the reproductive system, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So it is this hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis that ultimately controls the release of hormones that will direct reproductive physiology. And of course, there is negative feedback active in this system, such that when we have enough estrogen or progesterone or testosterone, it will feed back to turn off further production of that hormone. So I want to talk a little bit about the target organs of the HPG axis, which are the gonads. They're reproductive structures primarily, but they have secondary function as endocrine organs because they make and release hormones. So this is sort of an anatomic sketch or cartoon of the major organs in the female reproductive system. The ovaries, which are paired, sit off to the side in the abdominopelvic cavity, and they are the female gonads. The testes are the male gonads, and they are enclosed in the scrotal sac, which is, of course, interconnected with all the other reproductive organs. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize about the hormones that are produced by the gonads, the ovaries and the testes, is that they are, first of all, steroid hormones. So the way that they act on cells is to diffuse through the membrane, bind receptors inside the cell, and then have an influence on gene expression in the nucleus. The gonadal hormones are actually produced in both sexes. So it is not true that only males have testosterone, only females have estrogen. In fact, all of the gonadal hormones are actually produced in both males and females. They are just produced at different levels. So for example, estrogens, the main one that we call estrogen that does most of the activity in humans is called estradiol. It's one of a family of estrogens, as well as progestins, a family of gonadal hormones that progesterone is part of. These are both produced by the ovaries in females, and their function is in reproductive function, as we'll talk about in a moment. Also, they're responsible for the development of secondary sex characteristics during puberty, such as growth of the breasts, widening of the hips, onset of menstruation, development of growth of pubic hair, things like that. So they are both at higher levels in women. In males, estrogens are indeed produced. They're produced by not the gonads, but they're produced by adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. So there is always some low level of circulating estrogen in males. Androgens is a family of steroid hormones, the main one being testosterone, that is produced by the testes in males at high amounts, starting at the onset of puberty, with reproductive functions and also development of secondary sex characteristics, including increasing muscle mass. But testosterone is circulating in females at lower levels because it is actually produced in small concentrations by the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands of males also produce testosterone. It's just that a lot more is produced by the testes, and as a result, the main contributor to testosterone in men is from the testes. So, gonadal hormones in animals have well documented and well studied effects on the brain, and in particular brain regions that are involved in reproductive behaviors. And this is because there are actually receptors for these gonadal hormones on neurons in the brain. Now, in animals, what happens is sort of a two-stage effect. Early on in development, right before and just after birth, in rodents and many other mammalian species that are non-human, what has been demonstrated are these organizational effects where gonadal hormones will bind receptors in the brain and permanently organize brain structures and brain circuits that are involved in reproductive behavior. And what this means is that males and females will actually develop different brain circuits for reproductive behavior. There is a sensitive or critical period during which the gonadal hormones can have these organizational effects. After that, the effects will no longer have any effect, the hormones will no longer have any effect on the brain. So this is typically what will happen in rodents. And then what happens is, so you have these circuits for reproductive behavior that are set up early on in development, and then with the onset of puberty, the equivalent of puberty in these rodents, what happens is these higher levels of circulating gonadal hormones will actually bind to gonadal hormones in these circuits that were organized early on and produce sex-specific patterns of reproductive behavior, some of which we'll talk about later in a later lecture. So after adolescence and puberty in animals, the effects of gonadal hormones are to sort of turn on or activate the circuits that were set up early in development. Now, the big question in human reproductive behavior is whether gonadal hormones have similar effects. Do male and female brains develop differently because of the effect of gonadal hormones early on in life? And that is an open question, and we'll be discussing in this unit some of the evidence for and against. Clearly, one of the arguments against is that there is not a stereotypical behavior for sex in humans. There is a vast variety of reproductive behaviors, whereas with rodents, males tend to mount females, females tend to arch their backs to this receptive posture, to receive males as they are being mounted, and those kinds of stereotypical reproductive behaviors are the result of organizational effects early on. And it doesn't appear that at least with respect to sex behavior and the kinds of interactions that humans have, that there are organizational effects in the brain. There may be some organizational effects in other ways, which we'll talk about later in this unit. So one of the things I wanted to talk about before we move on to talking about the development of male versus female, a process called sexual differentiation, is just what is happening in adult humans, what it is that the gonadal hormones are doing in males and females to enhance reproductive physiology. What is their role? So it turns out that the gonadotropins, LH and FSH, which are released from the anterior pituitary, have two different effects on males, but both of these effects are occurring in the testes. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, will actually bind to cells that are in the testes that produce sperm. So FSH actually stimulates sperm production. Luteinizing hormone, the other gonadotropin, actually will bind receptors on cells that make testosterone. And so testosterone will be produced in response. It will circulate in the blood and have effects on all sorts of target cells, the reproductive organs, as well as cells that are involved in male secondary sex characteristics, such as a more muscular body form, the Adam's apple in the larynx, the voice box, facial hair growth, things like that. And you do, of course, need testosterone in order to produce sperm. So that testosterone has action throughout the body in males. But in general, the results, the effects of the HPG axis are basically activational in males just to keep the reproductive system functioning, to produce sperm, and maintain sort of male pattern of anatomy and physiology. In women, this process is quite a bit more complicated. As you know, there is a monthly cycle that involves the fluctuation of hormones. And so I just want to briefly kind of describe how this works. So we still have GnRH from the hypothalamus triggering the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. And what happens early on in the monthly cycle, here, this is a picture of the ovary. What the ovary contains are immature, really immature eggs. So the sperm, obviously, the reproductive cell for the males, the eggs or ovum, reproductive cells of the females produced in the ovary. And what happens with women is that they are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have in their ovary. And then those eggs live in these little immature follicles. So it's kind of like a structure of cells that protects the immature egg. And they just sit there until they're stimulated by hormones. And so once a month during the reproductive years, on average, follicle stimulating hormone will come along, and it will stimulate the maturation of a subset of these follicles in the ovaries. And as the follicle that contains the egg starts to mature, it starts to get more cells. And the more cells there are in the follicle, the more estrogen gets produced. And so when you get to fully mature follicles, you'll be getting high levels of estrogen, and that typically happens, you get this increasing levels of estrogen over the first couple of weeks of the cycle as a result of follicle stimulating hormone stimulating the development of the follicles that contain the eggs. Now, what happens about midway through the cycle on day 14 is that the high estrogen levels that are produced by this very mature follicle trigger a surge in luteinizing hormone, and that stimulates ovulation. So the follicle will eject the egg so that the egg can then travel through the reproductive ducts and potentially meet up with a sperm and be fertilized. And then once the follicle has ejected the egg and ovulation has occurred, the remaining remnants of the follicle turn into an endocrine structure, a hormone secreting structure called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, as it develops, starts to secrete high levels of progesterone, which triggers changes in the uterus, which is where a fertilized egg would be implanted and grow and develop throughout the different stages of pregnancy. And this progesterone is changing the lining of the uterus to make it friendly for implantation, to give it the nutrients it needs in order for the fertilized egg to implant and develop within the uterus. So that is sort of what's happening in the second half of a monthly cycle. Now, eventually what is happening is that the high levels of estrogens and progesterone that are being secreted, they are going to provide negative feedback onto the anterior pituitary, which is going to turn off FSH and LH. And if the egg is not fertilized and there's no implantation in the uterus, what will happen is that blood vessels will start to degenerate in the ovary. The levels of estrogen, as a result of negative feedback, estrogen and progesterone will drop, and this will cause the sloughing off of the uterine lining during the period of menstruation, and then the cycle starts all over again because levels of estrogen and progesterone are low, and so follicle stimulating hormone will start to get released and the whole process will happen again. So that's sort of a very brief, condensed view of the monthly menstrual cycle. And these are, of course, activational effects of all of these hormones in the HPG axis. And this goes on a regular cyclical basis over the course of a female's reproductive years, from the onset of menstruation until menopause. At menopause, which typically occurs, around age 50, it can happen a lot earlier or a lot later. What happens is that the ovaries stop secreting high levels of estrogen, and as a result, you get this progressive decline of these hormones rapidly in a couple years space, and a woman no longer is capable of ovulating and becoming pregnant after menopause. Estrogen helps to maintain bone density as well as muscle mass, so it is important to counter the effects of menopause with exercise and vitamins and good diet. I just wanted to mention that as an informational aside. Now, one of the things that I wanted to explain about the female cycle is the way that hormonal contraceptives work. It used to be just a pill, now there's a patch, there's actually an implant you can get, there's a ring. Any kind of contraception that involves hormones, what it is doing, it is either supplying estrogen or progesterone or both, just depending on the depending on the type of contraceptive. And what it is doing, these hormones, these hormonal contraceptives provide a steady dose of estrogen and progesterone that is sufficient to exert negative feedback onto both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Now, how does that keep a woman from conceiving? Well, if you have negative feedback onto these structures, you're always going to have very steady, moderate levels of estrogen and progesterone. Without elevated levels of estrogen, you can't get the luteinizing hormone surge that triggers ovulation. So it's sort of a trick that the contraceptives do by not allowing the levels of the gonadal hormones to fluctuate, and by maintaining them at a steady concentration, it exerts this negative feedback that tricks the brain into thinking that the body has no need for ovulation. And so without ovulation, you can't get, obviously, you can't conceive. There can be no fertilization. The other thing is, for a progesterone-only pill, the levels of progesterone are kept low enough that basically it does not allow the uterus to develop a friendly environment for a fertilized egg to implant, and without implantation there can be no pregnancy. So both of these hormones can be involved in hormonal contraceptive, and they take advantage of sort of this negative feedback system. Now, the whole point of both the male and female gonads is to produce the eggs and the sperm, and you can't do that without these hormones, as I have just described to you. And the purpose of that is so that the egg and the sperm can fuse together, become fertilized into what a single cell called a zygote, which contains all the genetic material of an adult human. And then this single cell undergoes very, very rapid cell division. Cells become specialized into different kinds of tissues and organs to develop into a complete adult human. So this process of producing reproductive cells, allowing them to fertilize and then develop into adults who then will undergo further production. This cycle is all directed by the gonadal hormones in both men and women.